Friends, I would like to welcome each of you to our public square lectures, an opportunity for us to reflect on how it is that we, as providers of theological education and folks deeply engaged in trying to create and shape a new future, will be able to bring our resources along with those of other people of goodwill to affect and to shape and change the public square of which we are a part. So I want to take this opportunity to welcome you, and I would like to now turn it over to Dr. Lakisha Lockhart, who is going to provide us with an opening and centering moment.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. I appreciate you. So hello, welcome. So first, just take a deep breath. Let it out. Take a minute just to, I don't know where you're coming from or what you're doing while you're here, but just get your body ready, because I don't know about you, but I'm excited about what's about to happen. So just get comfortable, get ready, right? So just, if you need to do some shoulder movements here, I know everybody can't see me, so just, I'm moving my shoulders pretty rapidly. So whatever you and your body are needing, just give it a little wiggle, make some space, create some space. There we go. And I don't know about you, but when I read, because, probably like most of you, I did a little Google on who was going to be speaking. I did a little bit about, making it a reality. She seems an amazing story. And so when I was just thinking about this, I said, it reminds me a little bit of Howard Thurman and talking about the sound of the genuine and who someone is and their story. And so to start us, I just want us to name who we are in this space, just your name. But I'm going to give you a little bit of what Thurman said in his 1980 commencement address at Spelman College, when he said the sound of the genuine. He said, "You are the only you that has ever lived. Your idiom is the only idiom of its kind in all of existence." And then he goes on to say, "There is in you something that awaits and listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. And sometimes there is so much traffic going on in your mind, so much different kinds of signals, so many vast impulses floating through your organism that go back thousands of generations, long before you were even a thought in the mind of creation. And you are buffeted by those. And in the midst of all of this, you have got to find out what your name is. Who are you?" So right now, I invite you to breathe deeply. And then when you are ready, and however you choose to, I want you to share, who are you? What is your name? Speak it in this space. So unmute yourself whenever you are ready, and I will gladly start. I am Reverend Dr. Lakisha Renee Lockhart. Who are you? And name yourself in this space. Don't be shy. We want to know you and your idiom.
I am Kim.
Come, Kim.
I am Reverend Dr. Ronna Case.
I am Kamal Sinclair. Happy to be here.
I am Reverend Darren Beardimple, California mommy.
I am Reverend Lisa Noel Zook, and I am Nana.
I am Roxy Stardancer.
I am Catherine Eaton, and I'm so happy to be here.
I am Donald Hanson.
I am Howard Wiley.
Welcome, Howard.
I am Minister. And I am Minister Adrienne Philpart, Dreamer.
Who else do we have? Name yourself in the space.
I am Sam, and I'll go with Adrienne. I'm a dreamer.
Is that everyone? Is that everyone that's here that's wanted to name themselves? Be expansive, take up space, go ahead.
Liv Coleman, and I am a friend.
Mm. Anyone else? Have we all named ourselves in the space? I know our good president hasn't yet. I think maybe he's waiting to the end, you know, to bring it home. Anyone else want to name themselves in this space? You are welcome. Oh, yes, in the chat. Yes, come through in the chat. Okay. Very full. Yes, please eat that lunch because that is also a real thing. Thank you. Anyone else? All right, we're gonna, oh, President Ray, do you want to name yourself? Because I know you were gonna go. I don't know if you want
Oh,
to.
I'm sorry. I'm Stephen, the guy in the bow tie.
Yes, know that you all are welcome. And again, just take another deep breath in. Let it out. Let yourself just be expansive. I don't know what's going on around you or in your day, but just take a minute to move and know that you are welcome and just to make space for whatever is we are about to engage. I am excited. And just know that you are the only you and your story matters. And I am glad that you named yourself to take up space in this space and excited for what is going to come. So yeah, so another deep breath. Let it out. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Lakisha Lockhart. We are so grateful for that opening and centering moment, now that we can all be present. Let me take an opportunity to introduce our speaker and say what a joy it is to have her with us for this public square lecture, to have her with us during this time. Kamal Sinclair is making the world more beautiful. As the executive director of the Guild of Future Architects, a group of which I am very proud to say that I'm a member, and artist at Sinclair Futures. She served as an external advisor to the MacArthur Foundation's Journalism and Media Program, Onassis Foundation, and New Museums New Inc., ONX Studio or ONX Studios, Civic Signals for Freedoms, a member of Sharon Chang's family office, Dream Office of Imaginary Friends, and as an advisory board member of MIT's Center for Advanced Virtuality, a Starfish Incubator, and IB. Previously, she was the director of Sundance Institute's New Frontier Labs program for 7 years, which supports artists working at the convergence of film, art, media, and technology. During that period, she consulted for the Ford Foundation's Just Films program on a research project aimed at furthering equality in emerging media, which resulted in Making New Reality. Sinclair got her start in emerging media as an artist and producer on Questioning Bridge, Black Males. At Question Bridge, where she and her collaborators launched a project with an interactive website and curriculum and published a book exhibited in over 60 museums and festivals. So we are indeed pleased and honored to have Kamal Sinclair with us as we begin to imagine what a new future might look like. And indeed, after coming out of the long evening and sometimes dark night of the recent past, it is good to imagine what the day might look like after the morning. Kamal, thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here today so that I can share a little bit of my journey with you all. I also want to thank you, Dr. Ray, for being in community with me. I've been deeply inspired by you and your work and your thinking, so I hope I can reflect a little bit of that back to you today. So I also, want to acknowledge that this is a tough day in Chicago right now, and that I just want to send love to everybody that's in Chicago right now, and also obviously the nation and the world as we continue to navigate pain and trauma from the ways in which we have not yet designed the optimal systems around justice, around all other kinds of aspects of our shared lives. So with that, I'm gonna start my screen. I tend to have a lot of slides in my slideshow, so please bear with me. But you can know that all of the information I'm gonna be sharing is available. So it might feel a little bit like you're drinking from a fire hose in terms of information, but I'm doing that so that you can get a sense of the breadth of what we're negotiating here. And then, we can find points to go into depth as we continue to build community. I also want to just acknowledge I'm coming to you from Los Angeles. This is the historical land, the traditional lands of the Chumash, Tongva, and Tatavayan people. I welcome you to put into the chat where you're coming from if you're not coming from Chicago, and any ways in which you want to acknowledge your home communities or the places where you stand or you sit right now. And I also want to acknowledge these 4 institutions, as Dr. Ray shared, have been very supportive of since 2016, as I've been doing this work around looking at equality, originally starting from looking at equality through the lens, like looking at emerging media through the lens of equality, but really that opening up such a wider conversation around the ways in which we're designing our futures. And so you guys probably are aware on some level that we are about 40 years in to a new era of media. This is different than broadcast mass media in many, many ways. But when you think about the power of that time from the point of the printing press till about 40 years ago, when we were able to take information and share it on a mass scale, when you imagine people being able to have a Bible printed in their home everyday people could have that in their own home, or a Quran or a Torah, Bhagavad Gita. These are things that really start to change changed our relationship to information. When you imagine the television of, during the Vietnam War and people seeing a war televised into their homes for the first time, the moment when we saw space, we saw Earth from space for the first time. These are critical moments in which, media, the access to a perspective on our reality changed us in fundamental ways. And of course, people from the arts and the humanities are always in collaboration with those in the sciences and technology in terms of contextualizing what does that mean? Those that are coming from religious practices and cultural practices are very much about what does this mean for how we understand our truth as these kind of perspectives on our reality start to open up with the expansion of science and technology. And so right now, the expansion that we're in, we're seeing not only one-way media like mass media, but we're seeing this ability to do robust interchange, for better or for worse, of interaction in our communications. We are also seeing technology that is becoming embedded in every part of our architecture and landscape in terms of the Internet of Things and the ways in which every object is becoming connected to an omnisphere of information and data gathering and data collecting and distribution. We're seeing information that is becoming independently intelligent. And we are also seeing we're seeing technology that is even becoming integrated into our bodies. And so there are some huge questions that come when you're dealing with this level of disruption to everything we know. I mean, even the author Yuval Harari wrote a book called Homo Deus around the bioengineering and the ways in which these technologies are going to affect us, claiming that we may be entering into a whole nother version of a humanoid from Homo sapien. I mean, crazy ideas. I mean, just, I don't want to say that word because I'm a person with a disability and so is my family. So I know that term can be misunderstood, but we are seeing just this drastic different relationship in terms of human capacity. So I say that because I'm a dancer. What am I doing in this world of bioengineering, technology, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence? This is me at 18 years old, performing with the show Stomp in New York City. And then I decided to go back and get an MBA and came out and started working for the Woodruff Art Center in Atlanta, working with the Symphony and the High Museum and the Alliance Theater. And I learned a lot there about the ways in which power and structure and the politics work, and how arts and culture are part of that. Then this was at the dawn of social media, YouTube, and all of these things is when I was here. And I started seeing how I was trying to negotiate, especially because it was a predominantly white campus in a predominantly Black city. How do we diversify this community? How do we break the brick and mortar to bring more generations in that are digitally engaged? And so that led me into this whole world of emerging media and transmedia. And I brought some of those ideas into a collaboration with a number of artists, where we mediated a mass dialogue among Black men in America called Question Bridge Black Males, using these kinds of transmedial aspects of the ways in which people can interact and the ways in which stories can travel and connect over platforms. And this went around for 10 years to museums, and now it's archived at the Smithsonian African American Museum. But what it opened up for me was this whole new way that artists can make meaning with these technologies, and in ways that are kind of indigenous to these technologies that are not possible with more traditional technologies. And there's always a unique indigenous property to every technology that allows us to tell a story, whether it be film or television or a book. But we were experimenting with these emerging ones. Got me to Sundance, where I ran this program for 10 years. And that put me into a different level of relationships to power. That put me in the World Economic Forum in 2017, where I'm sitting across from the head of Baidu, the largest search engine in China, the head of Infosystems, just this incredible level of conversation around artificial intelligence. And I'm the only artist or cultural leader in the room. And I was like, what am I doing here? You kind of feel a little out of place. But not just in that one context, but I mean, I was at this kind of epicenter of, industries like film and gaming and technology, at this kind of crossroads with storytelling and activism and charitable works. And it was this really interesting tension place for somebody who did not have a technology background, started out as a dancer and had to hold this space. And I really questioned, I had my own imposter syndrome that I had to navigate. And then I realized I absolutely am the person that needs to be in those rooms. Because when I walked into those rooms, there was nobody that had the particular identity tags that I had. They weren't Black, they weren't a woman, they weren't in my age group, they weren't a single Black mother with 3 kids. Like, there's different elements of who you are that I got to bring some representation into the room. And if I wasn't in the room, it wouldn't, those perspectives would have been missing. And so that's what I started to really encourage more and more, as I saw when you do curate in people that you don't normally see having these discussions about massive aspects of our systems as human beings, how things can get, assumptions can get challenged in wonderful ways, and optimization of things that wouldn't have been seen also get uncovered. So we are in what they call the 4th Industrial Revolution. That is, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, it's, immersive technologies and bioengineering that are gonna fundamentally change the way we work, the way that our products and services exist, the way that our cities are designed. And so just a little peek from the artist lens on what some of that might be. We all know about geo-aware or geocached things. This is a symphony that was written for the mall on Washington. So you literally, no matter where you walk around the mall, the symphony changes based on your own physical location in relationship to the to the park. And when you go to the obelisk in the middle, the timpanis and the chorus come in and the entire symphony comes to life. And if you go to another part, just the violins. So this is music that is not even composed in a linear way, but it's composed to a map of a geographical space. You have, and what are the ramifications of that for the future of our cities and the ways we relate to each other? This is a home AI. We're all familiar with Alexa. This is a storytelling project where they have all the characters that are coming out of this audio-based storytelling episode to be in conversation with you as audience members. So it's kind of like you're part of the story and you get to play with the story. But the thing about this conversational artificial intelligence is that it can also take over the lights in your home. It can turn on the popcorn. It can order Amazon. It can do all these things in the context of the story. So even storytelling and relationships to entertainment, the relationships to all kinds of information are changing with this omnispheric and interactive relationship to full environment, not just a screen. There are, pieces, this is an augmented reality piece that uncovers all the ways in which your data is tracked by every movement that you make, so that we can be more aware of where privacy ends and begins. This is virtual reality. You guys have probably heard or experienced a little bit of this. This is social, so people are physically touching and being in this virtual world. It looks like this on the outside, it looks like this on the inside. It's a pretty stunning experience. Hyper reality, this is someone getting to experience zero-G space experience while in a virtual reality headset. This is technology, computer vision technology that is taking someone's body movements and voice in real time and transitioning it into an avatar. This is Bjork having a conversation with the Tate Modern curator. This is a virtual reality piece that tracks food, so you can physically eat food, and that food is tracked in your virtual reality experience. So you can have kind of Alice in Wonderland type experiences of you bite something, you shrink, you eat something, you drink something, you grow, eat me, drink me, or whatever the version is. I think I might have got that backwards. This is the Royal Shakespeare Company with a Royal Shakespeare monologue that can happen on your coffee room table, right from the theater to you. And then this is data storytelling. This is something that is nothing new. We've always seen, I remember seeing these beautiful things from, I think it was Langston Hughes or was it James Baldwin? I can't remember, but they had drawn all these beautiful outlines of Black data, handwritten with pencil and pen. But this is what this is about 15 years old of the way you would see all of our data start to take visual shape. This is a project that scrubbed 65 million scrubs from blogospheres to give us a sense of the fluidity of human emotion. It was quite compelling. They were even able to construct a sentence, a life sentence based on the age groups and what were the most common emotional states. And it said in the beginning, 10s and 20s, people were in anxiety. As they went into their 30s, they were in kind of a resignation. As they hit to their 40s and 50s, they got to contentment. And when they got to the 80s and 90s, the biggest word was blessed. So kind of like being able to scrub 65 million data points helps us to have this ability to reflect on the human condition in very different ways than just from a single perspective. But now that kind of data is moving into the Internet of Things, where my colleagues at MIT say there will be no screens as we know it, telephones, tablets, and laptops in boxes, but everything will be part of the story, part of the interaction. So this is an object that was made by an Afrofuturism group in Brooklyn. You can walk it around New York City, and whenever it crosses a place where a Black person has been killed by a police officer, it lights up. So there's not a story, and there's no audio, there's no video, but this is a digital object that tells a deep story based on the place your body stands in relationship to the history of that place. Artificial intelligence, this is getting extremely good. I just got in the mail yesterday this book written by an AI and one of the members of the Guild. This is a film that one of the members of the Guild worked on that, basically the AI wrote the script, costumed it, did all the blocking, and wrote the music for this short film. It's hilarious and it's kind of gibberish, but after scanning, I think it was like 1,000 sci-fi scripts, it was able to replicate a sci-fi film. This is an artist that took the social media data of a guest list and had the social media, had the smart algorithm she built, to the artificial intelligence she built to invite people in groups of, I think it was 5 or 6, to join the party based on their compatibility as a group that would have an excellent experience together. And then she put an earpiece in her ear, and the AI was able to tell her, instruct her exactly what to do to be the hostess of the party, what to say, what kind of anecdotes to share, what drinks to make for people. And this is really an experiment in the future of labor, and to challenge whether an AI can construct a better emotional social experience than even a human. This is the Shoah Foundation. You may be aware of this. It's been around for a while, but they've been doing they've been creating holograms of Holocaust survivors. And they interview them like 1,000 questions or so, put it into the smart algorithmic database, so that as you speak to the hologram through natural language processing, the hologram is able to be in conversation with you. So it's as if you're speaking with a Holocaust survivor. So the idea behind this is that capturing the stories are not something that's a flat and static thing once, but something that can also be explored through your curiosity for generations to come. And I've had a conversation with this gentleman, and it's quite compelling how well he was able to hold a conversation with me as a ancestral AI. More about AI, there's a lot. Blockchain is being used. This is an artist, indigenous from the Iroquois Cayuga clan, that is working to, which is the Iroquois Confederacy had already created a constitution that our founding fathers of the United States, took the majority of the tenets from to establish our constitution. And it was really interesting. She's now taking those things and putting them in blockchain so that the history is never lost again, and also trying to keep the stories of the making of history in real time today put in blockchain so that we can always have a diversity of perspective on history. This is a robot, one of the most socially advanced artificial intelligence on the planet. And when this artist, Stephanie, found out that it was made based on the kind of lived data of a Black woman, she goes, wow, you don't see Black women represented in technology. I want to go meet this robot. And so she spent 4 years in conversation with this robot, Bina 48. And after, what was really interesting is that she could see where the robot was really quite profound and philosophical, and asked really kind of challenging questions. But then she also saw where this robot was not educated on some aspects of Black female identity in this country. She would call her programmers her master. And she was like, no Black woman is going to call anybody their master. So these are the kinds, so she wanted to be in conversation to help see if she could help educate her on like a more nuanced relationship. And so now she's got another AI that she's developed that is 3 generations of women in her family have been giving their oral stories to this AI, and it will live on for 100 years based on their data and grow and continue to learn as it grows. So there's a lot of stuff going on. We have, wearable, things on our bodies. This is a video game you can play with your just by putting it on your head and thinking. We're becoming cyborgonian in the amount of technology that we could put into or onto our body. And we even have a community of cyborgs emerging. Some call them grinders, body hackers, cyborgs. This is a gentleman who's had this implanted in his head for over a decade that turns color into music, and he's colorblind, so it helps him to hear the world of color. This is an artist that implanted a camera in the back of his head. This is a project that we showed at Sundance that they took exoskeletons, virtual reality headsets, and that same technology that you can think with your brain and your brain, and it gives input to the technology you're using. And so paraplegics were able to say, move my legs. They saw their legs move, and then the legs of the exoskeleton moved. And after 6 months, they were able to hold their bowels and move their toes. So this technology is literally changing the relationship of our bodies and kind of wiring our bodies in many ways. And then last but not least, in terms of this kind of survey of technology and science, that is, we can now encode data and information onto our DNA, onto DNA molecules. So this is one of the first moving images that we ever had for film, the Muybridge running horse. That was encoded on a DNA and it was recalled. And this is the recall, just a little grainier than the original. And when I met with a venture capitalist and asked, well, wow, does this mean in the future I can like have a clone dog that would have the DNA that the dog's DNA would embed my family archives or something? And he said maybe, but he said it's not yet like a DVD where we're going to be able to have easy recall of all this data that we're storing in DNA. Then one of the artists at Sundance did put 40 years of her video blogs onto her DNA and we showed that film at Sundance. So now you've got like this deep storage. It's pretty crazy, right? But now it's not just storage. At Caltech a few years ago, they were able to create artificial intelligence with DNA, allowing the DNA to read handwritten numbers, which is pretty, rudimentary intelligence, but it is growing. And now they've been able to create robots that are completely made of xenobots, which are made of cells. So these are like, when you think about the ways in which we're able to, even Bank of America said there was a 20 to 50% chance we were in the matrix in one of their annual reports to their shareholders. And so I just really want to think about this power of imagination, and when people invest in it as innovation and how they bring these things into the world, it's pretty astounding what people can do. I think about this being the most amazing technology in the 90s, and then how one of the scientists that worked on this script ended up creating that very thing, and it continued to go. So now this is old technology, but that's the power of how something is pure fiction to become reality. Someone said that 80 something, I was at a Afrotectopia, and Ashley Jane Lewis, a scholar, said that her research showed that 80+% of all technology that exists today was first found in a science fiction book or in a movie or in a magazine. So this is the power of imagination to bring things to life. So let's think about that power for a second. This is an artist that went around New York City and grabbed just things off the street, hair, fingernails, cigarette butts, and was able to go to a biohacker lab in Brooklyn, and was not only able to understand their DNA profile from health and ancestry, but she was able to run the DNA through the FBI DNA profiling system and 3D print their faces. And so you have this sense of, is privacy even possible if someone can, take a swab off of a drink at a restaurant and be able to find your face? She went even further, and this is definitely crossing some ethical boundaries, but she did it purposely to try to show the vulnerabilities in these breakthroughs so that we can understand how we want to negotiate that as a society. She ordered a vial of saliva off the internet, and the person that had donated their saliva for medical research, or not donated, but sold their saliva for medical research, was told they were completely private, that they were anonymous. But she was able to pretend to be this person on 23andMe and other DNA sites. She was able to find his Facebook profile, was able to find his home. She was able to go to his home. And also she was able to clone his tissue. And so there's this level of like, whoa, human beings, we have a lot to kind of consider as we do this together from a social and from a responsibility standpoint. This was one of my interviewees that I thought really says a lot, not just for racial justice, but the justice writ large. How do we develop how does the progress of justice and the development of these technologies, how are they not linear? How do we think about that every time we develop a new technology, we have to think about the history and the systems of oppression that the technology is being created and released into, and think about ways to bend that technology to justice and not worsen, entrench, replicate injustice. So that I got, as I said, I got kind of somehow ended up at this ground zero moment around, particularly around virtual reality, because we had the very first Oculus Rift headset prototype came to Sundance in 2012. And I was there when it was just an intern trying to hack a phone to bring an experience from a VR headset at USC that couldn't come off campus. And then that intern was able to, in 2 years, take it to a Kickstarter, take it to a venture capital round, and then to a $2 billion sale to Facebook. So 2 years later, I'm at this huge I'm at this huge tech conference for for 1,000 people that got picked out of 150,000 people that were developing the technology around the world. And when I walked in the room, I was the only Black woman. I was one of the only women, like out of 1,000 people, there was like, I could count 30 women the whole time I was there. And it was really astounding to see the homogenous nature of those that were in the room at the kind of epicenter of this new technology. I mean, covered time, all this stuff. And I was welcomed and people were excited about the whole opportunity. But then at the end of the conference, one woman stood up at the plenary session and said, hey, what are we going to do about the apparent gender gap? And from the stage, they basically said, we don't have time to play gender politics. We got to get this $2 billion return on investment for Facebook. And the people in this room represent the best of the best. And it was almost all men. And so it was one of those moments where I was like, that just doesn't seem true. And it kind of was, especially because in the world that I was looking at this through, we curated, Sherry Freelo, the head curator of New Frontier, had curated Sundance that year, all VR, and it was 68% women, people of color, and queer folks. So it just didn't match up from what I was seeing in the field around who were the best of the best. And then I went to MIT, and a professor there, Sep Kamvar, head of social computing, said, code is the new superpower. Code defines a social process, and that social process defines our world in very literal terms. He talked about Twitter and food trucks and Airbnb and real estate. So then I went to Google and met with Robert Wong at the creative lab there. And he said that he felt that artists and people from the humanities were being marginalized in the great tech race, and that he feared if they did not get centered, that we would not be able to design a human-centered future. Then I went to Skull World Forum at Oxford, and I sat next to the head of the futures department for one of the largest tech companies on the planet. And he said, oh, I'm so happy to show you this video of the future. And he showed me a video of the future from their lens. And it was really impressive technologically, but pretty homogenous and pretty soulless. And I said, so who's in the room with you guys when you're imagining this future? And he said, oh, we're all engineers. And I already knew from the statistics that they were also likely mostly men and mostly white. And I said, well, where are the people from the arts and the humanities? How are you imagining the future without them in the room? And he goes, oh, that's a blind spot. And when I was in grad school, I remember having to read this case study about the Space Shuttle Columbia and the analysis that NASA made around why that tragedy occurred. And essentially what happened is it really came down to not having enough diversity of thought in the room as they were developing the spacecraft, as they were getting it ready for launch. There was no ability for people to kind of penetrate the hierarchy with any red flags, any need for better optimization of something. And I think it's a great metaphor for where we are with these incredible opportunities we have with the technology and the scientific breakthroughs that are coming, but also realizing that over the last, we've done this many times before. When the dawn of film, this was the first film. And we know that that wasn't just a one-off for KKK propaganda, but it still, even today, impacts the way in which we see ourselves. This Black boy, the old doll test and the new doll test. We know the implicit bias. We know one of the police that murdered Amadou Diallo in the 90s, when the smoke cleared and saw that he was holding a wallet, he sat on the steps and wept. He said, I have become the monster because of this fear that he had of this Black Haitian man. And then we even know from the work of the Implicit Bias Project, how few people, even Black people themselves, that are able to identify positive words with Black faces. So this is not benign that we have these, and you think about even industrial revolutions, and you think about the last, the major industrial revolution in the 1800s into the 1900s, and this activist, Heather Ray, Indigenous activist and filmmaker, she said, we just got the bill from a 400-year run of not having inclusive design around our systems and industrialization, and that was climate change. And I think if climate change is the bill for the last 400 years, what is the bill for what we're dealing with now with xenobots and smart algorithms and omnispheric data collection? So I was at school walking on this cobble street and I was really depressed. I was like, what are we gonna do? We can't penetrate. Everybody's going on automatic pilot. And my colleague turned to me and said, it hasn't happened yet. And it reminded me of Jayton Jacobs and how she was able to be a voice of intervention in New York City when massive building and innovation and designing the future of New York was happening. And she stood her ground and said, hey, you're not taking Washington Square Park. We're keeping, this may not be efficient. I know you want to put a freeway through here, but we need this green space. She didn't win on the projects that went off on the sides of Manhattan that we know have been some of the worst social experiments in poverty and limiting health and well-being. But she did hold this park together. But what other kind of interventions can we make in this time of rapid innovation? And of course, there's personal change, institutional change, and systems change. But I think there was this moment when I was on this panel that, the head of Baidu, the Chinese search engine, he looked at me and he said, oh, we're so happy Sundance is here. Because when we don't have any more work for anyone because of AI automation, we will have film and gaming to keep them busy. And that was just like a sucker punch to my gut. I was like, I do not want to be here to try to help satiate the masses. I was like, what? He was very dystopic to me. But then the gentleman right next to him, from the CEO of InfoSystems, he said, look, I've already outmoded 11% of my workforce. That's 30,000 people. He said, but instead of firing them and, side note, letting them just play video and games on the side, he put them in an imagination department and resource them to imagine what's next. If this work is no longer here, who do we want to be going forward with that abundance of time, with that abundance of resources that this technology is promising to be? So I really think about, how do we democratize the imagination of our future? How do we look at that fork in the road of leadership, satiate the masses, or really empower them to think beyond even our own limitations of what we thought humanity can be? How do we unleash human potential so that we can see a version of human beings in a society we've never even seen before? Could you imagine? I asked my sister, I was like, if she, had a 4-hour commute for 25 years, going from Sacramento to San Francisco, and I said, what if you only had to work 20 hours a week and still cover everything you needed to live in terms of house, healthcare, and all these things? So what would you do with all that time? Because it's not just the 40, 50 hours a week she did at work, it was also 4 hours a day in commute. And she said, if I had that time, I would have started children's community arts and culture programs in my community. And so just think about what gets unleashed when we're not in a very particular relationship to time. So I'm going to skip around. I'm just going to talk a little bit about co-creation. Some of the influences of this have been the co-creation studios at MIT. They did this beautiful report on collective wisdom and how this is not a new concept. In fact, majority of human advancements over time have been done through co-creation, but they don't get the same kind of publicity because they're not the lone genius, or they're not kind of coming from that ego place. They're usually people that are more effaced in history. There's different ways of relating to this. It really, I'm trying to, requires deep listening. Relationships to time are reframed. You have to deal with, civic trust, public good, all these wonderful things. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead because I'm running out of time. But so we got to do some experimenting with this. This kind of helped us see the Guild of Future Architects. We did a world building residency at USC with artists and all kinds of other experts from other fields around the future of work in cities. And we imagined the future of LA and work in an AI automated world. And the Kauffman Foundation, who underwrote it, was so impressed that they brought it back to Kansas City, and they brought this wonderful intersection of people from all over Kansas City to imagine the future of Kansas City through the same kind of speculative imagination, world building work. And they had, you know, the Muslim woman with a hijab who's an educator, the guy with a Trump hat on, they had the Black church elder, they had the Latinx sports announcer, the white horticulturalist. And they, out of all three months of this process, they decided that they wanted to be the most biodiverse city in the country. And the thing that was so beautiful about it is they didn't just allow it to be a dream, but they allowed it to move into reality. So now they have a public benefits LLC, and they're doing the regenerative farming work, they're building the infrastructure, and they're seeing success and moving towards that goal as a city. So a little bit of the Guild, we have a 100-year vision. We really looking at, you know, democratizing imagination, cultural change, expanding human potential. I'm going to skip through a little bit. We've been using this thing called Futurist Writers Room, which is like this speculative imagination space. We did a lot of IRL versions of it, in real life versions of it before the pandemic ended. Even one in kind of collaboration with Octavia Butler by reading her body of work, as we did it on the future of Blackness. And then future of food, all kinds of things. And then COVID hit. And we were like, well, how do we understand this moment of disruption as an opportunity to imagine what systems we wanted to develop coming out of this, and try to not return to systems that got us here in the first place, in terms of not just the health implications, but racial reckoning and all the things we're dealing with. So we ran a series of sessions going not only forward in aspirational futures, but we also went back to alternative paths, like what if we had made a different decision at different points in history over the last 100 years. And those things allowed us to see, one, the power in a decision, because we're now living the futures that they imagined back then, but also what are some of the learnings from the choices so we can understand what are the design principles. So we went back to 1970, looked at when they made, they started giving funding to factory farms over family farms from the US government, which a lot of food experts say is the beginning of the pandemic of foodborne illnesses that we deal with today. And when we went to see who were those Congress people that made that choice, yes, there was lobbyists and greed and big ag and all that. That was probably part of that decision. But also those Congress people were children or young adults during the Depression, and they were the parents of the boomers. So they saw starvation in this country, and they saw more mouths to feed than ever. So this idea of abundance through factory production looked like the right thing to do to produce enough food for people, but it was an imbalanced thing to do. And it ended up creating a pandemic of all kinds of diseases, and is creating a extraction of resources from the earth that is not sustainable. So how, now that we're coming out of a pandemic, how do we learn not to just react to the current trauma, but to have foresight, you know, so that we don't design ourselves into another corner. And so long story short, we did all this stuff, and now the insights, some just a slice of the pie have been released as of yesterday, called on this report called Portals with the Omidyar Network. And some of the provocations that we kind of synthesized through about 1,000 hours of these sessions was questions like, are we finally departing the extractive age and welcoming in the regenerative age? How do we move from the era of destabilizing information into an era of, actually we changed it to trusted wisdom. This is an earlier version. How do we dismantle industrial age silos between work, home, education, play, and community? And what if shared well-being became the standard of success for our nations? And when we went back and we wrote these speculative narratives about what that might look like in 2036, but when we went back and looked at the historic design, GDP, which is currently the standard for success for nations, we found the economists that created it said before Congress in 1934 do not use this metric. It will actually be dangerous for social well-being. It is too limiting. It doesn't consider caretakers at home. It doesn't consider all these other aspects of social well-being. It just shows us, the domestic product. So how did we get stuck on that? Well, we found out that, they used it as a political lever after World War II to try to get certain resources going, but then we all became so dependent on it that we started going automatic pilot. We didn't even realize that we were designing ourselves into a collective well-being crisis. And then we did some, looking at the trends and what are some of the things that might be helping to, what are some of the things that are broken, working, whatever that. And then we looked at a spectrum of possibility. How inevitable or unlikely or impossible are these things that might move us towards collective well-being? And had like brief ideas about, this is a real chiseled down synthesis of what a future where we do focus on well-being might look like. But the thing is that we don't want this to be a dream deferred. When I talked to a brother who was part of a Future of Lagos campaign, and they did this kind of work all over Lagos. And I said, man, that must have been amazing. And this is years ago. And he said, it was amazing. We imagined some amazing futures for Lagos. He said, but I wish it had never happened. He said, because now it's a dream deferred because no investment came in to support it. So it's almost dangerous to just catalyze the catalytic imagination unless there's the commitment to invest in those ideas that come from the community. So I'm over time. This is one of, so for the Guild, we're trying to make sure that we don't just do dream deferreds by creating investments. This is one of our shared futures that is building 80 blocks in Baltimore of circular care systems, cradle to grave care, where biological and non-biological caregivers get to live with children and elderly who need care. And it's all and they get paid fair wages, they get resources. It's just a beautiful system. And this has been in consultation with the Domestic Workers Alliance around what is it like to have dignity as a caregiver in this country. Same with the NEST program. This is the Kansas City program. AI for the People is another one of our programs, shared futures that we support. So with that, I will just show you some pictures of the community trying to bring in a better future and say thank you for your time and attention.
Okay. This is a overused term, but I'm going to use it anyway. My mind is blown, so I am. Thank you. Yeah, I need to go sit down somewhere for about a month and just think about what you just shared with us, Kamal. But there is a question on this. Is the only one I can make sense of right now, and that's why I wrote it down, because I said, I'm going to get through listening to Kamal. She's going to take me on a journey where my cognitive capacity is going to be so overwhelmed that I'm only going to be able to spout gibberish. So now I wrote a question down, and I'm glad I did. What does it mean in view of all that you've shared with us to talk about the public square? What does that even mean? Because for us, we've placed it at the center of but what does it even mean to talk about a public square, given the realities that you've described?
It is one of the most challenging questions. And I think many of the members of the Guild are asking that question, like, how do you create in the digital space, and in this, particularly as the digital space expands into all these objects and smart homes and smart cities, how do you truly create that, the essence of the public square? And one of our members, Eli Pariser, who started moveon.org years ago, started upworthy.com years ago, and just is now working on a project called Civic Signals. And they are doing all this research on how do we look at traditional public spaces like libraries, parks, and kind of the place, the public squares of old, and try to see what are those physiological principles that can now be replicated in a digital way to create greater rails against not only misinformation and bad actors, but even our own worst instincts that allow us to come in with a different persona and relationship to each other. When we did Question Bridge Black Males back in the day, I mean, we had gotten 1,000 videos. By the time I came on, they had already filmed 1,000 question answer exchanges between Black men all over the country. And these were extremely vulnerable and authentic and powerful insights. And so we were really concerned, like, what are the ethics of putting this online? I don't want these men to get abused and trolled and, dealing with the toxic space. So we decided to shut down the comments and the likes and all that kind of stuff and say anybody that wants to engage in this community has to engage on camera. And we had imagined some people would try to hack it and, do videos that were not appropriate. But the tone that was set by those initial videos that were uploaded, we never had anybody ever troll or create toxic energy and the project was going for 10 years. So it's interesting to see how when you set a certain tone around how you show up, it's like, someone comes to your home and you ask them to take their shoes off. It changes a little. It'd be like, okay, that's how we showing up here today. Or you know what I mean? Like there's just a little bit of a something that we as humans do click. So, I mean, that's not the answer, obviously, to the extremely complex question of what is the future of the public square. But I do think that we can't get lost, that there's always got to be an anchor into the physical reality to physically being able to spend and share time and share food and with each other to help balance the opportunities that we get. Like now, I wouldn't be able to be with you guys right now if it wasn't for this digital space and this virtual space. So there's beauty here, but that is the challenge. I think that there's always got to be those physical anchorings to not let us completely lose our way.
So I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to ask, we'll begin to invite others' questions. One of the things that I've been a student of the various kinds of very cataclysmic behaviors that humans have done in the past, whether or not it is genocides in Rwanda, the transatlantic slave trade, the Holocaust. And there's one thing that I've really thought about and written about a little bit is that the precursor to all of those is not just the capacity of humans to imagine a future, but actually human beings believing in the future that they've created, in which some other people have become exempt. And that power of belief, right? Because it's one thing to imagine, but once that gets connected with the power of belief, it can either be world making or world destroying. So, I mean, I would just love to hear your thinking about that, the intersection of imagination and belief.
Absolutely. I also got deeply fascinated by, I mean, I'm half Black, half white. And when I was in 6th grade, I went to all Black school, and one of my classmates came up to me and told me my mother was the devil. And I knew that my mother wasn't the devil. My parents have been married 50 years now. And even back then, she adopted my older brother and sister. We had always had this incredible home of love and bringing all kinds of folks into the home, really believed in racial equality on a very deep level. And so I knew my mother wasn't the devil. But when I was looking through my sanitized history book of the 6th grade, I was like, ooh, my mama ain't looking too good. We need to go about colonization and imperialism and all these things. And so I just remember, so it put me into a curiosity that still I'm curious, I follow today, but in my work as an artist in my early 20s, I spent a couple of years looking at what are the conditions of atrocity that make us complicit in atrocity? What are those narratives that will get the nice 17-year-old kid in Sound of Music to turn around and be a Nazi? Like, what is the conditions that shifts people into that? I found during, lynching pictures before Without Sanctuary book came out in the New York Public Library. And I remember this little white girl's face with a bob, blonde hair, blue eyes, standing in front of a mangled, lynched black male body. And I'm like, she's 4 years old. Why is she, what is that doing to her soul to be in a mode where she's told this is normal? I couldn't see a dog die like that and not be traumatized. So these narratives are so incredibly, and what I found similar to what you're sharing is that people, and it's not just this country. I mean, I went back and I was like, and I looked at every single population on the planet. And I was like, we've all done something horrible to somebody else. There's nobody's DNA that's clean of being complicit in atrocity at some point in our history. And so I looked at what I thought these kind of algorithms of complicity are. And one is, a narrative of fear that, people, when they're really afraid, they will become complicit in atrocity. The other is narratives of dehumanization. When they don't see the other as human, they're much more willing to participate in atrocity. And the other is, but more rare as a motivator, which is the greed part of it. We promise that you're gonna survive the scarcity of the planet where others may not. And that's just dog eat dog Darwinism, so social Darwinism. So those kinds of, so I don't know, that's been my study to date, but it sounds like we've had very similar observations. But ultimately that's why in the Portals project that I shared with you, we have a whole section called New Literacies. Like, how do we educate our children to be immune or inoculated from those narratives that can get us to be complicit in atrocity?
Thank you for that. I think, and then I'm going to turn to a question in the chat, but I think, particularly what that drew me to was how do we ensure that something like, if you study the category of race at all, you can actually pinpoint when someone begins to create what will become a doctrine that will shape the entire world. And how do we, when we're looking at technology, when we're looking at all the evolutions that you've been talking about, gain a sensitivity that we may be in one of those founding moments that is going to make a sense-making category that's going to exist for 600 years.
Absolutely. I mean, that is a powerful statement, and I'm glad this is being recorded because I will refer back to it. Because I got a chance to go to the Vatican for an art and technology conference, and I had my first mass in the Vatican. Like, it was amazing. But I sat in this, and there was like Amazon and Facebook and all these different kinds of people were in the room. It was about 50, 60 people that were invited to be part of this. And it was when the Pope was trying to, it was the focus on tenderness was the focus of that year. And the question was, how does art and technology come together to support a campaign of tenderness around the world? And I remember sitting in the Pope's Academy of the Sciences, where Galileo was the first president. And I'm sitting around a table with almost all men. I was the only woman at this lunch. It was a lunch table, and they were talking about disrupting the currency of today, because especially how poor countries in Latin America and Africa are always in consistent debt, because it was all these things about how do you change the dynamics of the global currency system. And I'm sitting there, and I'm in like Target clothes. I'm like, and I'm like, how did I get to this table, number one? But I also thought, this is ridiculous. They're talking about disrupting global currency systems. Like this is huge. Like, what, is this just and then the Pope's personal finance advisor came and sat next to me to hear the pitch. And he just sat, he listened for the 15-minute pitch, and then he said, this could work. And the whole table erupted with excitement. And I'm like, oh, this is on this very land over 2,000 years, decisions have been made that have changed the course of history for 600, 1,000, 2,000 years. So we do have the power in a room. We do have the power. How did I get there? You know what I mean? I think that is hard to believe. And when you do the alternate history work, when you go back and say, what if we had done something different? You really do see, oh, solar power existed before fossil fuel technology. Why didn't we make that choice? That was not that long ago. That was only 100 years ago. So anyway, these are, I really want to honor what you said. We should think in those terms for sure.
So we have a question from Donald Hanson, and he wants to know, what do you mean by architect? Because when you were introduced as a future architect. And when you began to talk, it seemed to take on whole new meanings. What do you mean by architect?
Oh, thanks. It's a great question. And, and I do get a lot of mail for like architecture, like literal architecture associations and promotions. But it is a metaphor. And the members of the Guild, to date, we have 190 members. And the goal is to have people from all different systems backgrounds, because the reality, like one of the things we found in the research that I was doing with the Ford Foundation, and it resonates in so many other peer research efforts, is that we've kind of gotten to this point of hyper specialization in society. And when you're so hyper specialized to the point where, like I was, one of our members was working with microbiologists on creating, mapping the cellular structures into virtual reality so that medical students could see all the cell structures in an immersive way rather than just on a piece of paper or on a flat screen. And he said he was astounded by the fact that, you know, one expert only knew mitochondria, like was the hyper specialized, you know, expert on mitochondria over here, and the other one, and they were just not even able to be in the same conversation all the time and trying to unpack all this stuff. And so I think part of what we lose, and I found this particularly in the science space, is that we lose some visibility around where things intersect. So example, Pascal Feng, who's a professor at University of Hong Kong, told me when I was in China that she's one of the top roboticists and engineering professors in the country. She said her students are so hyper specialized into trying to get these algorithms and these robots to work, they don't have even the capacity to come up to a more 30,000 foot level and understand the sociological implications of this technology. And they don't, and so you need to have all these kind of layers of complexity being curated into the room so that we can see that. So Stanford came to me when I was at Sundance at New Frontier, the program I ran, and they said, really, I thought quite, you know, kudos to them for saying this, but they had done a survey and they had found that essentially they had put a generation of tech leaders into Silicon Valley that weren't prepared for the roles that they had to play in the global systems that they were disrupting, particularly from the lens of culture, sociology, and the ways in which it impacted people's lives. And so they now are shifting to have every single student in their campus having to have some deep relationship with arts and humanities in order for them to be prepared to understand the greater implications of the technologies that they're stewarding. And so I say, when we talk about future architects, it isn't a literal architecture, and it's not just one area of expertise, but it's about how are we bringing people together to consult and co-create ideas about the future systems, which are going to be intersectional and complex.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have another question from one of our professors, Dr. Christoph Ringer. And, you know, here at Chicago Theological Seminary, a significant piece of what we do, in fact, the majority of what we do is prepare people for different kinds of public ministries, both in terms of religious communities, as well as in terms of nonprofit, but generally living their faith into the world. So this question, are there principles of design you would want to see adopted by those preparing for ministry? And I'm going to add on to that, those preparing people for ministry.
I keep muting myself. Yes, there are some things that have come up that have been pretty strong refrains. I mean, I think the design principles that we could talk about are many, But a couple of sources that have been very inspirational to us is one, there's a book out now called Design Justice. And this is a really deep look into community-led practices to build the worlds we need. And I'm going to put a link in the chat they started out as this group of activists and artists and media technologists that were meeting at the Allied Media Conference in Detroit. And then they started to develop this set of design principles. And then a professor at MIT, who was part of that group, went on to do deeper research and turn it into a book. So that has some important things like, how are we thinking about, instead of, we kind of come from a tradition, particularly in America, where there's this layer of expertise. If you think about Silicon Valley being that layer of expertise around technology, and we kind of know, and we kind of prescribe to everybody else what they need to be wearing or what they need to be, how they need to be thinking about doing their lives differently. And in this book, they talk about, before going into a community and prescribing solutions to whatever ails them, creating a space to listen first, because the solutions may already be there. They're just not resourced well, or there's just some power obstructions that are limiting them from being able to take care of themselves, to solve their own problems, or things were working really well and then they got disrupted by an outside factor. So I mean, these are just some, another one I really love comes from, I mean, this is very, a lot of people are looking at this, but universal design principles, which comes around people with disabilities, how we're designing with people with disabilities first, but it goes so much deeper than that. How are we designing for the most marginalized in a group society context first? Because we found that when you design for the margins first, you design for everybody better. Example, texting was not designed for people that have hearing and could talk on a phone, and yet it has changed all of our relationship to conversations. These are just some little glimpses. Another really great resource is Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Murray Brown. And she's really a student of Octavia Butler, who really looked at nature in many ways, like slime mold. Octavia Butler, the author, was a student of slime mold, which is the most egalitarian colony of substances on the planet, and how the slime mold will get to a food resource and send it all the way to the furthest part of the colony first, and then slowly the one at the food source gets fed last. Like, these kinds of principles are kind of looking at how are we, I mean, not every, insight into nature is an exact analogy for how human societies should work. I mean, the lion eats the antelope. I don't know if we want to necessarily design that for us, but there are the Emergent Strategies really talks about, instead of like a command and control approach to design, one that allows for more people to come and put their fingerprints on something, and to let it be more emergent and dynamic and more just.
Mm-hmm. Well, that last comment you raised, one of the things certainly that many thinkers, theologians have trouble with for a long time, and that is that if we simply go back to trying to be, I won't say back to, but to being in tune with the reality of creation as it exists, is that the most basic reality of creation, the world as we know it, is predatory, that all life is parasitic on other life. So if that becomes, and that's the most basic point, how do we design a new world in which that is a reality, but it is not the basic truth? If you sort of see what I'm getting at. So you muted again.
Yeah, I mean, that is something that I think we all, as a person of faith as well, there's these relationships to our understandings of truth that there is a critique out there that I've been kind of part of listening to the conversation around, and that is the idea of progressivism, that we are always advancing as civilizations, or we're always getting better generation to generation, which, I do fundamentally hold a belief in that, we do learn from our past and we do grow. It's circular, it's dynamic, it's not always, it's not a straight line by any means. But and I also recognize that every generation needs to go through some level of the poetry of life, and that poetry is not just the joys of life, but it's also dealing with the full scale of the emotions of what the human experience is, and it helps us to grow spiritually. So I do believe that as well. But there are some assumptions that I think we may have mixed up and conflated in that, that may need to be reevaluated. And one of those is, looking at the notion of scarcity. We know that in this, it's something that we talk about in this new research project, that essentially in the 1800s, there was a fear that we were growing so fast, so many people were being born on the planet, that we were going to run out of resources. And so that's where kind of one of the kind of things that instigated the industrial age was we have to manufacture abundance because nature will not give it to us. And the interesting thing is those came from communities that were just based on their kind of natural climates, places that were more scarce than equatorial societies. And if you look at the value systems that over tens of thousands of years developed in equatorial communities versus where there's more scarcity on the kind of tops and bottoms of the earth, you'll start to see a different relationship to the faith in abundance that comes from nature. And so I think that's an interesting tension right now, because the scarcity-based model of economics has led to actually what was supposed to be manufactured abundance has now led to crisis of ecological collapse because it has just been extracted. So if we take the value systems of kind of equatorial communities, then, like, for example, I studied in anthropology when I was an undergrad. One of the last kind of hunter-gatherer tribes in the middle of Africa, and there was this value system that the more physical things I had, the poorer I was considered, because I had to carry that to the next place that we migrated. So the poorest were the ones with the most things. The richest were the ones that could walk more liberated, go to the next place, and had the skills to find the tools all over again to gather and to hunt. So I think that that's an interesting model around faith even. Like, how much faith do we have that we're going to be able to create a system of regeneration so that we're not having to store, hoard, and overproduce? What does it look like when we can create systems where there will be regeneration? Anyway, I don't know if I answered your question or not, but.
No, I certainly appreciated that. And let me open the mic. So if there are some of you who have a question that you haven't been able to cogently form into a chat question, but just have a thought that you would like to explore, I'd like to invite you to step into the space now. We have about 10 minutes left. So if there is anyone who has a thought that they would like to explore or a question, please unmute yourself and step into the space.
My question has to do with who's at the table.
Yeah.
Could you say more, Howard?
Yeah.
Well, just listening to how she describes who's at the table, you're basically talking about white men historically, and who's at the table in terms of power and wealth and resources. How do you address that? I mean, how do you think about that?
So I'll tell you a quick story of 2 years ago, we were raising money for one of an organization that became one of our shared futures. And we got an opportunity to sit down with a 42-year-old billionaire. And he had a $2 million offer of a grant on the table. And he was a white male. You know, he was in, you know, tech and science. And, you know, it was me and two other people just sat with him and were telling him about this project. And it was really deep because until the kind of racial reckoning and backlash and all the things that started coming out during the Trump administration in the very beginning, he didn't know that there was an issue of race in the United States at all anymore. He was shocked, actually. He thought we had solved all the racial inequity issues in the 60s. And so he was kind of pretty aghast at the fact that he could be as wealthy and as powerful as he was. He ran the #1 venture capital firm around a particular technology in the world. And that he could be that ignorant of the reality of Americans that were just minutes away from where his office was. And so he went into this deep kind of reading over kind of a year and a half of, and just like all these layers of his own blind spots started coming off. And he was like, whoa, all this has been going on and I've been living in my comfort bubble. And I remember, but he would say things that were kind of, you know, you know, well-meaning, but offensive. And I just like, I felt like I was like coaching somebody, like it was just, you know, he would say things like, oh yeah, there's not a single racial group other than the Native Americans that can claim America doesn't treat them exactly fair. And I said, oh, okay, well, you should read Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander and see how, you know, that the systems of the systems of entrapment and so forth around Black people, especially Black men, have continued this whole time, and that there's more people enslaved now than there were during 1850 slave census. And he was like, through mass incarceration. And he read it overnight, came back to me the next day and said, wow, I am so sorry. I had no idea. I really was sounding ignorant the other day. And we went through this whole wonderful kind of process. But at the end of the day, when we had the grant contract in front of him, he said, I can't sign this unless I have absolute control over every decision that's made. And I'm the one that gets to make the final decision on every creative and programming decision. And we had to say, you would cause more damage and put us back if you were in that position because you don't even understand the situation yet. I said, your role right now is to do deep listening and to really come from a place of humility right now, because you're not the smartest person in the room right now around this issue. And he didn't sign the contract. So these are the kinds of things that we have to work through. I don't think it's a lack of people being out there that want to understand the dynamics, but it's so ingrained how we understand our relationship to power and money that we just have a lot to reconsider. And the diversity is not in the room yet. I mean, when I was looking at this research, there were 6 CEOs that dominated artificial intelligence globally, 6, and they were all men. And quite frankly, they were writing the rule book on how AI would come out to every single aspect of every other human being on the planet's lives. And that's not okay. Then I went back to Oppenheimer's gang and I looked at old pictures of who got to decide on the atomic weapons, and they were similarly all men. Few women were in the pictures, and I thought, you know, we really need to make sure we're not following these patterns without considering, you know, who needs to be at this table. And it's not altruistic; it's survival.
I'm thinking that it also presents a challenge to how we imagine social movements and movements for social justice. I mean, we have to really think what that, rethink or think anew what that means in this particular historical moment, because the strategies and the organizational frameworks that have operated in the past, the way you describe things don't work in this situation and will not work to bring about the kind of change that's needed at the level that you're talking about.
I forgot to say one important fact about that person, which is like the whole point. He said that the reason he had never given a philanthropic dollar in his life, and the reason he was even considering this was because he sat with another billionaire friend of his that was of the same age, and they both realized, they were like, we have been working our entire lives to build 10 generations of wealth forward. Like that's been our goal, 10 generations of wealth forward. And he said, but we realized for the first time that there will not be 10 generations forward unless we go laterally to our fellow man today. And so that may be like one of the levers that might shift some of the perspectives on who gets to be at the table. But that's just, that was just one little insight I wanted to add to how we might break the mold.
So Yasmin, you have a question. Yasmin is our resource librarian and the one who keeps us connected to the best of the knowledge that is being produced in the world, as well as the depth of learning and wisdom from the past. And she has a question. So Yasmin, could you ask your question?
Yeah, hi there. Thank you for that, Dr. Ray. I raised a question in the chat box about Timnit Gebru and how she was fired last December. She was Google's AI expert, and she was raising the alarm bells over how this technology is going to impact minority communities and all sorts of other ethical considerations that, Google's not paying attention to. But Google silenced her by firing her. At least that's how she describes it. So how do we push back and hold companies like Google accountable for pushing aside their own experts? I'm like, this isn't even outside. It's even within the company itself. When they do have those voices coming forward, they're just, cast aside.
This has to happen, I believe. I don't think this is one of the situations that it's going to be self-correcting by industry. We have got to have a commons conversation around this. I'm putting a couple of resources in the chat.
Sophia was my colleague in grad school, so I'm glad to see you.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, she's awesome.
Awesome. Well, Sophia is a member of the Guild, and so is Dr. Ruha Benjamin. I will say this. When I first got into this space back in 2012, I definitely felt like the only person in the room, and like I felt very much alone in my observations, and I felt very dismissed as well. I was in I was in the room with the president of a major film and television production company. I won't say the name, and they were looking at how did they catch up with Netflix, because Netflix was just got their first Emmy, and they were like, oh, we're doing it old school, we got to start doing it new school, like with the streaming service and the algorithms that the streaming service works with. And I had said to them, all these business analysts in the room and AI experts, and I said, I think it's dangerous to only use these algorithms to curate these exact kind of curation of content for each specific person, where you're only feeding them some version of what they've seen before. I said, I think you're narrowing everybody's worldview to a dangerous point. And I also think that you're even cannibalizing your own catalog, because people don't get a chance to see the diversity of things on the catalog. And they basically looked at me like, oh, that's such a Sundance nonprofit thing to say. You don't understand the power of these algorithms. And that was 2 or 3 years before the filter bubble and the echo chamber critique started coming out around how this was creating the binaries where people could not, the red and blue content that are completely different, that no people aren't even seeing the same information to have a conversation about anymore. And so I absolutely agree that I've had that experience, not to the level obviously as Timnit, but where you're silenced and you're dismissed for raising something that's not going to bring the most return on investment. And I remember being in this president's office, and he had posters all over the place. And it wasn't just the poster, it was poster with box office in giant numbers, like all the box office numbers. So that shows you the value system there was, we don't care if we narrow people's worldview till they're at war with each other on ideological cultural war, as long as we're getting those box office numbers. And so I wish I had a better answer for you, that how do we do this? My community, I'm sure everyone in this call is part of that in some way, shape, or form, but it does have to happen at higher power levels than just the companies themselves. When there's few people like Jack Dorsey or others that are trying to put some constraints or guardrails around it, but it's pretty, and we're going in, why did Jeff Bezos leave Amazon to build manufacturing in space, low orbit space? So there's a whole colonization and kind of land war, quote unquote, happening right above our heads in the atmosphere as we speak, And it's just none of that. The everyday people, we're not talking about that at all. We're dealing with our everyday. We're trying to pay our light bills. How can we think about who gets to have control over manufacturing in near orbit? You know, it's crazy.
Well, Kamal, thank you. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful time together. So applaud, snap your fingers, do like this with your hands, however you communicate our appreciation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you all so much. It was wonderful to be in conversation. I love this chat. I hope you guys save it because I would love to read it if possible later.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Kamal. We so appreciate it.